You know the story. A beautiful girl, an evil stepmother, a poison apple, 7 cheerful dwarfs, a prince who breaks the curse with a kiss. Everyone lives happily ever after. You've seen the film. You know the songs. You probably watched it as a child, wrapped in a blanket, completely safe. That story is a lie, not a metaphor, not an exaggeration. The story you know was scrubbed, polished, and handed to you by a studio that needed it to be safe for children. But the original, the version that circulated in German villages in 1812, the version that adults whispered to each other by firelight, that story is something else entirely. In the real story, the villain is not a stepmother. It is her mother. Her own biological mother looks at her 7-year-old daughter and orders her killed. Not out of madness, not under a spell, out of pure, cold jealousy. And the prince? He doesn't kiss her awake. He finds a child's corpse in a glass coffin in the middle of the woods and takes it home with him. Welcome to the real Grimm. I'm going to tell you the story the Brothers Grimm actually wrote, before the censors, before the rewrites, before Walt Disney got hold of it. Every detail I'm about to share is documented. Primary sources. First edition, 1812. And when we're done, we'll talk about what Disney erased and why. Before we get into the story itself, you need to understand what the Brothers Grimm actually were, because most people have the wrong idea. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were not children's authors. They were academics, linguists, and folklore scholars working in early 19th century Germany. Their goal was preservation, not entertainment. Germany at the time had no unified national identity, and folk stories were one of the few things that connected the scattered German states to a shared cultural past. So they traveled the countryside. They sat with old women in farmhouses. They listened to stories that had never been written down, stories passed from mouth to mouth across generations. And they transcribed what they heard. The result was Kinder- und Hausmärchen, Children's and Household Tales, published in 1812. The title is a bit misleading. This was not a book designed for children. The first edition was intended as a scholarly record of German oral tradition. And oral tradition, before the modern era, did not sanitize horror. These were stories that served a purpose: to teach, to warn, to explain the cruelty of the world to people who had no other framework for it. Death was not hidden from children in 1812. Starvation, violence, disease, these were part of daily life. The stories reflected that reality. Over time, across 7 editions published between 1812 and 1857, the Grimms progressively softened their own collection. Biological mothers became stepmothers. Sexual content was removed. Deaths were made less graphic. By the final 1857 edition, the stories had already been partially sanitized. And then Disney got them. Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs was released in 1937. It was the first feature-length animated film in history, and it was designed for a family audience. To achieve that, the studio stripped out everything that made the original story disturbing. What remained was a fairy tale about a princess who needed a prince to save her. What was lost was something far more interesting and far darker. Let me tell you what was actually in that book. The story begins before Snow White is born. A queen, we are never given her name, sits at a window on a winter's day, doing needlework in an ebony frame. Outside, snow is falling. She pricks her finger, and 3 drops of blood fall onto the white snow. She looks at the red against the white against the black frame, and she makes a wish. She wishes for a child with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony wood. She gets exactly what she wished for. A daughter. Perfect. Beautiful. Snow White. And the queen dies in childbirth. In Disney's version, Snow White's birth mother is already dead when the story begins. She's a ghost. A memory. The story starts with the stepmother already in place. In the 1812 original, the queen, Snow White's own mother, does not die. She lives. She recovers from childbirth. She watches her daughter grow, and something curdles inside her. The queen has a magic mirror. Every morning, she asks it the same question. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all? And every morning, the mirror gives her the answer she wants. You, my queen, you are the fairest. Until one day, it doesn't. Snow White has turned 7 years old, and the mirror, which cannot lie, gives the queen an answer she is not prepared for. You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you. The queen goes still, her 7-year-old daughter. She calls for her huntsman, and she gives him a very specific order. Take the child into the forest, kill her, and bring back her lungs and liver as proof. She doesn't just want the girl dead. She wants her organs, because in the original text, the queen intends to eat them. This detail, often dismissed as bizarre, is consistent with widespread European folklore about witches consuming the vitality of the young to preserve their own beauty. The queen is not simply jealous. She believes she can consume Snow White's beauty. The huntsman obeys. He takes Snow White into the forest, but he cannot do it. Whether it's mercy or cowardice, he lets her go. He kills a young boar instead and brings back its lungs and liver. The queen has them cooked with salt and eats them. She believes she has consumed her daughter. Snow White runs. She runs until she can no longer run, until the forest closes in around her, and she is completely alone and completely lost. She finds a small house. Inside, 7 little beds, 7 little plates, 7 little cups. She eats a little from each plate, drinks a little from each cup. She is starving, and 7-year-olds do not understand property rights, and falls asleep across 3 of the beds pushed together. When the 7 dwarfs return from their work in the mines, they find her there. They let her stay. In exchange, she will keep house for them. Cook, clean, make beds, sew. She agrees. She is 7 years old, alone in the forest, and she has no other options. They give her one warning. Your mother will find out you're alive. Do not open the door for anyone. Back at the palace, the queen returns to the mirror. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all? And the mirror tells her, Snow White lives. She is with the 7 dwarfs, beyond the mountains. She is still 1,000 times fairer than you. The queen does not send anyone this time. She goes herself. She disguises herself as a traveling merchant and approaches the little house. Snow White, despite the warning, opens the window to speak to her. The queen sells her a corset, a beautiful lace corset, and offers to lace it for her. She laces it so tightly that Snow White collapses, unable to breathe. The dwarfs come home, find her unconscious, cut the lace. She revives. The second attempt, the queen disguises herself again. This time she brings a poisoned comb. She offers to fix Snow White's hair. The comb goes in, and Snow White drops. The dwarfs come home, pull out the comb. She revives. The dwarfs warn her again. Do not open the door for strangers. Snow White nods. She agrees. She is 7 years old and has already been strangled and poisoned by her mother twice. The third attempt, the poisoned apple. Half red, half white. The queen eats the white half herself to prove it's safe. Snow White eats the red half. She falls. This time, the dwarfs cannot revive her. There is nothing to remove. The poison is inside her. The queen goes home, consults the mirror one final time. You, my queen, are now the fairest of all. She is satisfied. The dwarfs cannot bring themselves to bury her. She looks too alive. Her cheeks remain red, her lips red, her skin white as snow. They build a glass coffin, lay her inside, and write her name on the lid. Then they keep watch. Years pass. A prince rides through the forest and sees the coffin. He sees the girl inside, and he wants her. The text is unambiguous. The prince wants to take the coffin. He asks the dwarfs to give it to him. They refuse. He begs. He tells them he cannot live without her, that she is the most precious thing he has ever seen. Eventually, they relent. He takes the coffin, with the body inside. There is no kiss. There is no awakening. He is taking a dead girl home with him. On the road back to his castle, his servants are carrying the coffin when one of them, exhausted and frustrated at being made to carry a coffin through the forest, stumbles. The jolt dislodges the piece of apple from Snow White's throat. In the 1812 edition specifically, the servant is so angry at being forced to carry this coffin everywhere that he opens it and strikes Snow White. That is what wakes her. Not love, not a kiss, a servant hitting her body out of frustration. She wakes up. The prince is there. He asks her to marry him. She says yes. She is still a child. The wedding is arranged. Invitations go out across the kingdom. And because propriety demands it, Snow White's mother, the queen, is invited. She consults her mirror one last time before attending. The mirror tells her the new queen is 1,000 times fairer. It does not tell her who the new queen is. She goes to the wedding. She walks into the hall, and she sees Snow White standing there, alive and white. She recognizes her daughter. Before she can react, the king's guard sees her. A punishment has already been arranged. Iron shoes are placed in a fire until they glow red. They are brought out with tongs and set before her. She is forced to step into them. And she dances. She dances because she has no choice. She dances until she falls. She dances until she dies. The story ends there. Snow White and the prince live. The text does say this. But the final image the Brothers Grimm choose to leave you with is not a kiss, not a celebration. It is a woman burning alive in iron shoes, being made to dance at her daughter's wedding until her body gives out. That is the real ending of Snow White. So why does the original story look like this? What were people in 1812 trying to process? Scholars have offered several readings. The most psychologically compelling is this. The original mother villain represents an anxiety that was real and common in pre-modern Europe. Maternal mortality was enormous. A woman who survived childbirth would often watch as her daughter grew. And in small communities where beauty and youth were women's primary social currency, an aging mother watching a younger daughter could be a sight of genuine, complex resentment. The fairy tale externalizes that resentment to its darkest extreme. It asks, what if a mother's jealousy of her own child had no limit? What if vanity could completely overwrite maternal love? Changing the villain to a stepmother, which the Grimms themselves did in 1819, only 7 years after publication, removes this discomfort. The stepmother is already, culturally, a figure of suspicion. Her cruelty is expected. Expected is safe. Expected is not disturbing. The biological mother is disturbing. And that is exactly the point. There's also something to be said about the prince. Modern audiences often find the Disney prince forgettable. But the original prince, the one who takes a dead child's body home because he's obsessed with it, is a far more unsettling figure. The original story doesn't frame this as romantic. It's presented matter-of-factly, which is perhaps more disturbing than if it were condemned. And Snow White herself, she is 7. She is not a princess awaiting rescue. She is a small child who is hunted, poisoned 3 times, placed in a glass case, and eventually married off to someone who found her while she was dead. She has essentially no agency throughout the entire story. The passivity isn't a flaw in her character, it's the point. She is the object of everyone else's obsessions, her mother's hatred, the dwarf's protection, the prince's fixation. So now you know the real story, and I want to take a moment to talk about what Disney did with it, because I think it's more interesting than people realize. Walt Disney first saw Snow White as a 15-year-old boy, watching a silent stage production in 1916. He never forgot it. 20 years later, he turned it into the first feature-length animated film in history. His own staff called it Disney's folly before it came out. It made millions. But to get it there, his team had to make choices. And those choices tell us something. The first thing they changed was the villain. In the 1812 original, the woman who tries to kill Snow White is her biological mother, her own mother. The Grimms themselves had already changed this by 1819, just 7 years after publication, replacing her with a stepmother. Disney kept that change, and on the surface, it seems minor. A stepmother, a mother, what's the difference? The difference is everything. A stepmother who resents her husband's daughter is a story about jealousy between strangers. A mother who orders her own child killed out of vanity is a story about something much darker, the failure of the most fundamental bond that exists. Changing it to a stepmother makes the horror comfortable. Expected. Safe. The original wasn't safe, and that was the point. The second thing they changed was what the queen actually wanted from the huntsman. In the Grimm text, she doesn't just want Snow White dead. She wants her lungs and liver brought back as proof, because she intends to eat them. Disney reduced this to a heart, kept purely as proof of death, with no implication of what comes next. The cannibalism disappears entirely, and with it disappears the suggestion that the queen's obsession with beauty had crossed into something ritual, something predatory. In the original, she wasn't just jealous. She believed she could consume what Snow White had. That detail changes the character completely. Third, and this one surprises people, in the original story, the queen doesn't just try to kill Snow White once. She tries 3 times. The apple is only the 3rd attempt. Before that, she comes to the dwarf's cottage disguised as a traveling merchant and sells Snow White a corset, then laces it so tightly that Snow White suffocates and collapses. The dwarfs cut the lace, and she recovers. Then the queen comes back with a poisoned comb. Snow White lets her put it in her hair, drops immediately. The dwarfs remove it. She recovers again. Only on the 3rd visit, with the apple, does it finally work. Disney kept only the apple, and losing the first 2 attempts loses something important. The portrait of a mother who is methodical, patient, and completely committed to her daughter's death. It also loses the portrait of Snow White as a child who has already been strangled and poisoned by her own mother, and still opens the door the 3rd time. Because she is 7 years old, and she doesn't fully understand what's happening to her. Speaking of which, Snow White's age. In the original text, she is 7 years old for most of the story. 7. Disney's promotional materials described her as 14. The film never says. But the change matters, because the original story isn't a romance. It can't be, she's a child. The prince, the wedding, the happy ending. All of that lands very differently when you understand that in the source material, this is a 7-year-old girl being married off to a man whose first encounter with her was trying to take her body home. And that brings us to the prince. The Disney prince is forgettable on purpose. He shows up, he kisses her, she wakes up. Love's first kiss. It's sweet, it's clean, it resolves the story. In the Grimm original, there is no kiss. The prince finds a dead girl in a glass coffin in the middle of the forest, and he wants her. He asks the dwarfs to give him the coffin. They say no. He begs. He tells them he cannot live without her. Eventually they give in. He takes the coffin, with her body inside, and begins carrying it back to his castle. She wakes up not because of love. In the 1812 edition specifically, one of his servants, exhausted and furious at being made to carry a coffin through the forest everywhere the prince goes, finally loses patience, opens the lid, and strikes her. The jolt dislodges the apple. She breathes again. That's the awakening. Not a kiss. A servant hitting a corpse out of frustration. And finally, the ending. Disney's queen falls from a cliff during a storm. The dwarfs are chasing her, lightning strikes, she falls. It reads as an accident, or at most as natural consequence catching up with her. In the 1812 original, the ending is deliberate. The queen is invited to Snow White's wedding. She attends. She sees her daughter standing there alive, and before she can react, iron shoes are brought out of the fire. They've been heating this whole time, and she is forced to step into them and dance. She dances until she dies. It is not an accident. It is not karma. It is a planned, public execution by torture, carried out at a wedding feast, and the story ends there. That is the final image the Brothers Grimm chose to leave you with. When you add all of this up, what Disney changed wasn't just a few details. They changed the meaning of the story entirely. The Grimm original is about a child who is hunted by the person who was supposed to protect her most, and about a world that is brutal, indifferent, and occasionally just. Disney's version is about a girl who waits and is eventually saved. The bones are the same. Everything else is different. And I don't say this to condemn Disney. What they made is a masterpiece of animation and a genuine piece of cultural history. But it is not the story the Brothers Grimm collected. And the story the Brothers Grimm collected is worth knowing, because it was trying to tell the truth about something, in the only language people had for it at the time. These stories survived 1,000 years because people kept passing them on. If you want to help keep the real versions alive, like and subscribe.